start. Hey everyone, today is March 2nd, and we are starting the Workload API sync meeting. We have two items on the agenda right now. Let me share my screen and then we can start discussing them. Please feel free to add any other items to the agenda here. And for now, Edwin and Roman, I think you have a proposal for the disaggregating serving multi-node workloads.
Hello. Yes, but Roman is still not on the call. I messaged him and see if he'll join. So maybe we can go second.
Sure,
See if he
no
joins
problem.
here.
No problem. So Matt, if we can start the conversation for the WAS controller integration.
Sure. All right. So, as promised, I created this document with initial thoughts on how an API on the controller side could look like for WAS in general. So, like enabling, but also specifying which policy I want to use, whether gang scheduling or not, and also being able to express intent to use some of the WAS features like topology or attaching the array claims to pod group. Overall, like I encourage everyone to go through this document. I try to like identify what are the goals this API should meet. I also analyze some of the other solutions that exist for like similar problems. For example, what Q does. Also took a look into how like Grove does it, but that's not really applicable here because in case of Grove, it's actually replacing controllers, not building or like adding functionalities on top of them. But it's still like some good a good place to take a look and like find some inspirations. There was like this idea about like that was floating around about just following this parallel of pod template pods that we have in many places in Kubernetes, having like workload templates that we can attach to a real controller. I also like shortly describe here why that's not a good idea. The TLDR is here, like we want to have this API to like one of the goals is to be minimal and to align with the dry principle, so do not repeat yourself. And like usually the real controller spec already provides some structure, right? For example, in case of job set, it's already a structure of job set that contains many replicated jobs, so which aligns with the pod group, pod subgroup template, or like might align with that structure. And like asking for expressing that again in a work on template, that's kind of asking for repeating the structure, which also has some other problems because what if the structure doesn't align? Then we need some validation, but overall, like that's too verbose, right? So one of the goals is basically if we can already get some information from other parts of the real workload, then we should just do that. And like the API should only express the actual policy, right? And like that's the idea behind this workload scheduling config. If you can scroll down a bit, so maybe we can start with the examples because that might be easier to parse. So a little bit more. All right, so basically we have this workload scheduling config that we can attach to a different level of a real controller. Sometimes there's only one level, like in case of a simple job, right? So we could do something, we are attaching the scheduling config, specifying the scheduling mode, some, let's say, topology constraint. And in cases where we have like more levels, like let's say another example job set, right? Then we can have this scheduling mode at different levels. And like some notes here, like we are not expressing things that are already defined, as I said, right? So we don't need to say that this is a pod group and this is a pod subgroup, if you could scroll down a bit. But also things like we are not really saying anything about min count because that's the information that can be derived from the spec, right? For example, in case of job, we already have parallelism, and that's how like, we will then populate or like create the workload from this data. So we are only adding the information that is not present anywhere else, and it's like then I like analyze some of the examples here. Overall, if you are like familiar with some controller, like we'll be integrating with us, but like I really ask you for feedback if you see places where this idea can break, or maybe where we need more, right? We need to provide some additional parameters, stuff like that. Something that may not be already not be covered here, and might be problematic to actually add to this structure. That we're really eager to see it, because that may impact the design. As I said, again, this is only a first proposal, so we are starting discussion here. I also try to looking at this scheduling configuration that basically will have new types. The idea is we'll define this structure in the scheduling API, and controllers will be able to basically import this structure and use it in their API. We need new types, even though let's say we have scheduling constraints already defined in the workload. And then because eventually this API will evolve and we'll have new levels, right? We'll have pod group scheduling constraints that we have right now, but we also have pod subgroup scheduling constraint, maybe pod set scheduling constraints. So here we have this single type, and there will be a library that will be helping translating, depending on the context, on where exactly this workload scheduling configuration is attached to what it should translate to. And that's the library is another section with some examples of how it could simplify actually the translation of controller spec to workload object. We have a few open discussions already in the doc, so I thank you whoever commented there. I think if I can summarize that, I think we have 2 or 3 main problems or things we need to figure out better. One is that we had this big discussion about default, and I think we are kind of aligning that ideally what we would like to have is that users don't need to write any config like that in majority, 90% of the cases. And this might be possible for some new controllers, or for some controllers where the user intent is clear, right? For example, for AWS, a single replica, leader, and workers, that should be gang schedule, right? So very likely that should be the default, and that is actually what user expect, right? But at the same time, it's not Kubernetes 1.0. We already have controllers job that have a long history. There's a lot of use cases for them, and we cannot really change the default now, right? And which default in scheduling is scheduling pod by pod, right? Then, so for those controllers, we rather cannot really consider changing any defaults, and satisfying the backward compatibility is the main requirement. But there might be places, like I said, AWS, some new controllers where we actually can start with the defaults that are expressing the user intent, and those defaults might be some WAS features like gang scheduling, right? So that's the idea. But I still need to, I think, document it better in the document. The other is about expressing more parameters actually in this API, right? So right now I try to I analyze maybe only the simple cases, right? And assuming that in the API we don't really express any pod count, because as I said, the mean count can be derived from size of the job. But there is a good argument that maybe in some cases we want to user may want to override this, right? And in the future we very likely will have advanced policies, and I think we'll be discussing one example today, right, for the disaggregated LWS, when let's say we may want to say some ratio between prefill and decode job, right? So there is a need to extend actually this structure to be able for the users to provide some more information, some more parameters, and we need to figure out what is overall the way forward that it will be backward compatible and that will align with the overall design. And I think the third one is that something that Wojtek started looking into, because this API, the workload-aware scheduling API will evolve, and also this API will have to evolve to basically allow expressing or using all these new features that we are going to deliver. And in some cases, some of those features, and again, maybe AWS is a good example, right? Very likely we'll end up there with a policy that only makes sense for LWS, right? Some ratio between prefill and decode. And ideally, we are looking into ways to conceptually somehow restrict, maybe visibility is not the good word, because that's not something you can achieve. But overall, we would like to make sure that when you are a user or library, right, or user of this controller, then like you know what fields actually make sense for this controller, right? And then when you try to set something that is not supported, you will either get like some validation error or you won't be able to. And at the same time, like we'll be adding new features here, and they may require like some code changes from the controller integrators, right? So we would like to have some sane process here, like some way to ensure that if we are adding new things here, because that's a shared structure, right? This workload scheduling configuration, then we'll be adding new fields here. Then until like the actually controller integrator makes some changes, like start supporting them in code, like users shouldn't be able to set them, because otherwise we are asking for trouble. Sorry, I noticed just now that we have some questions, so maybe let's go with them, because it will be better. Probably I already spoke too much. Who is first? Heba, is that you or
I was
Wojtek?
first, but I wanted you to finish. So like, because I have a comment that you are aware, but I wanted to give for the context, like summarize my discussions with Joe and Jordan. So
yeah. So basically, Wojtek, that problem, and yeah, that was so. Go ahead, Wojtek.
So basically, I started like I have linked a doc somewhere below in one of the comments, like how exactly we could approach, and well, it's not a proposal. It's more like a brainstorm and ask for feedback. And
it's at the bottom. You are looking for it, like the comment is at the bottom. Go down, and
this one. I think it was there. No, not this
no.
one. It was like somewhere. Yeah.
Oh,
this
here.
One. So basically, let me fix that in a second. So basically, I asked Joe, Betts, and Jordan for feedback on that, and like I think that they both said that technically what I wrote there is possible, but what they actually would prefer is not to have like a single type that is shared across many different controllers, but rather provide a building blocks. So like separate like the what we currently have like more as a fields in this workload scheduling constraints as types, and then like they would expect that every controller themselves would create the high level structure based on, or the higher level structure, the higher level constraints based on those fields. So like we would not have like a single type, but like effectively a type per controller that will be, and those types will be built from like building blocks provided by us. So I think that like I'm not convinced personally, but like basically it's another option that we should consider here. Like it's not yet written down like this as an alternative for us at like second option. Like we need to do that with Matt later, but like it's that was the feedback that like we got somewhere in the meantime from like API approvers perspective.
Yeah, if I can just add here, so like I understand their concern, right? And overall, it's hard to predict future, and we in the Kubernetes got like beaten already a few times when we just reuse the type in many different places, and then we wanted to modify only one place but not the other. So I understand this concern. At the same time, one of the goals is like to avoid fragmentation, and that is the problem with the solution I have that they are proposing, because there is a benefit in like having a single configuration here that is the same across all the controllers, right? Because once I get familiar with that, I just look at the other controller and I already know what is going on here, right? What is exactly the intent here? If we allow like every controller to like do it on their own, the risk of fragmentation, like some controller using different name for the field, etc., that will happen. But yeah, like we need to work with that and like figure out way forward. But and Heba, I think you have
yeah. Okay. Why don't we, instead of like introducing new API, why don't we just have the workload API edited, like when the user wanted to update something, and we can opt in, opt out that, like there's custom, like we updated the workload with a notation or a label in each API. So, for example, the job API, if I wanted to update this disruption mode, I will add an annotation or a label in my job API or my job object, and I will just go ahead and update the workload API that has been created using that, like using the controller. So in that case, the controller will just get notice that like there's customized field here, so I will not, like override them. I will just have, it's like a custom, it's like a user created a workload. Then I will stop updating the default field.
But I think that is effectively exactly the same. Like what the difference is that you are saying let's use annotation, and here it's like an explicit field. Like, but other than that, it's maybe I misunderstood like what you are suggesting.
I'm just trying to find another way other than creating this API for like for every controller, or at the same time having same fields or set of fields, like subset of the workload API fields exposed in the APIs, in each APIs, because I don't know, like because we wanted the user to override them.
I think the problem with annotations is it might make sense actually for disruption mode, but for like more sophisticated and more complex fields, like annotations are like very unfriendly to users, like to pass structured data, right?
I'm just the annotation here is just to inform the controller that there is, like the workload is custom now. Like the user has updated the workload. Okay, just that's it. So the control.
You don't want to pass the information.
I don't want it to pass the information. I wanted the user to update the
name of the
workload,
whatever, right?
Exactly.
Like the information there is some workload that I manually created as a user, right?
Exactly. So because the controller will create the workload API anyway, right? So if the user wanted to customize this workload, they can go ahead directly and update this workload and just add this annotation or label to inform the controller that I have already like updated the workload. So do not override my update.
So like we are getting into updating the workload, which I explicitly added to non-goals of this document because that's a separate problem, right? Like this general mutability. And like while we agree that some parts of the workload configuration that needs to be mutable, the canonical example is min count, right? And we need to do that. And that will be also like a separate document to follow up on that, to those basically support elastic jobs and other places where we need to update the min count. Updating workload for existing real workload in general, I would say that's probably not possible in general. Like just like some
the same idea works like for creation. Like what, like basically, if I understand correctly, Heba, like please correct me if I misunderstood you. Like the idea is that instead of like setting the disruption mode scheduling constraints, or like in the, let's take job example, in the job object, you first create a workload object as a user, and then you create a job with annotation saying that like the workload object already exists, like, and somehow pointing to it or like whatever. Like, so
okay, so
I think that like that, like I agree. Like we should like skip that mutation like for that, or like postpone it for as a follow-up discussion. But I think the same idea like could work for.
Yeah. So here, Matt. Yes, right. Wojtek, this is what I meant. So, Matt, here, the fields that you are stated in this configuration are the mutated ones, right? The ones that we are allowed to update. So
no, not really, right? Because like consider topology, right? You define some topology that say that a single replica or WWS needs to run in a rack. And then you want to change that, right? So what does it mean? Like, should you, in general, the only way to do that is to reschedule everything, right? Delete the replicas and create them. No, because like the new topology may be completely incompatible with the old one, right? And the same about like, I would say
Okay, so let me
Yeah.
let me try to tell you that. So, for example, we will have the default configuration for the topology, okay? And we will create the workload API or the workload object with these default topologies configuration. If the user wanted to update these topology configuration later, we will have to reschedule everything. So it is the same.
That was just the argument that like some of the fields, like for general mutability is hard in general, right? And in some cases we just want to, my answer may be you should recreate the real workload, because that's like, such a big change that anyway it won't be possible for like scheduler to, reconcile.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Like,
there are some fields.
Like my 2 cents about like your approach. Like the main problem I see here is that like that's against like this rule that we want to API to be like minimalistic and like to not repeat yourself, right? Because if as a user, let's say I only want to change topology, but other than that, I want to use the same defaults, right? In case of LWS, whatever, then I actually need to know the structure of the workload that the LWS controller will create, right? Like with the pod group, pod subgroup, etc., and only change like one tiny piece of information there, right?
This is, I agree with you. So I think we can
only add one line in the level that I want to change, and it works, right?
So
and
I
like
think
if I need to create the workload, then actually it's very error prone. Like, or like we need some validation, and you need to know what is the structure of the workload that is actually supported for this controller, because I can create a job set with just a single job in the workload, right? And like, what should we do with that, right? We should just reject probably.
I agree. So I think in that case, we can agree that we need to gather the scheduling configuration in the workload API under subspec. Okay, something like the workload scheduling configuration. This is I agree with you. So we can hence or we can guide the user that if you wanted to override whatever you want in the workload API, you can go to scheduling configuration and just update this. You don't care about anything else, or anything else is not. It's immutable, for example. It's immutable. You cannot update them. This is all what you are able to update. This can be happen, right? But without creating a new API, we can still have this structure inside the workload API that the controller is creating, and just pointing to the controller that, hey, this will be customized or updated. It's just because I searched this a lot, and I thought about this a lot.
I think about like this like comment on the doc, like we should add a section like with like your proposal and basically analyze that. Like let's do that.
Sure.
So because that will be like good for everyone, because that's a valid question. Like other people may have this question, why we're proposing this way, not the other, etc. Right? So
of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andre.
Yeah, did you were you first, or I can ask my question?
You can please.
Go ahead. Like
yeah. So I think first of all, I just want to like maybe ask from the high level idea of exposing some struct from Kubernetes to the underlying controllers. Do we have like a precedent in the past when we have the same idea for other features?
Pod spec, right? Pod template, right? Like basically all the controllers have pod template. Or
how would it work like in practice? Like, for example, like if we want to modify the struct in upstream, like do we need to expose a feature flag to the underlying controllers? Like if we want to introduce new API, etc.
Basically, that's the last section of this doc, and like that's something that Wojtek is working and like exploring more in his doc. We need some way, like Heba, if you actually scroll down, like that's an idea of like how we can solve that, but it's more like the last resort with these capabilities, right? If you scroll down.
The high level idea was that basically when like in your control, in your workload, your own workload, say job set for example definition, like you'd effectively need to explicitly enable or whitelist or whatever, however we call it, like certain fields in that. If
you would just scroll down, we'll have like an example of that for the capabilities. Like this one, for example, right? Let's say we can like just take a look, like like it's the last resort in a way, but like I fully agree we need something like that, right? If this is a common struct shared by all the controllers, like this is in the upstream, then like it will be changing. It will be like we'll be adding new fields there. We need to have a way for the controllers with like some same defaults that until they like actually flip this flag in their implementation, like this new feature is not supported, not you really said that.
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand like what is the limitation for us to explore, just expose workload template? Is it just because of it's less declarative, and we don't really allow, like some of the controllers might not allow to modify min count, etc.
That's like what I was explaining here with this like minimalist and like do not repeat it will serve, right? If you are asking user to create a workload, you need to repeat the whole structure, right? For example, for job set, that there is a pod group, there is a pod subgroup, etc., which is already like it is already you get that already from the structure of the controller, right? And that's very like verbose, right? And error prone, and yeah. So we want to avoid that, and we ask user to express the intent that like scheduling intent that's actually necessary, right? But like again, like yeah, please comment on the doc. Like we can have a discussion there. We can add sections. So
yeah, I mean definitely I can follow up on this. Like I think I have another quick question. So if you scroll up for the job set integration, right? Like we say that this struct can be embedded to the job API. So just to understand, so if we do this, like who will be still, so just job set controller will be still responsible to create the final workload, right?
Like it's always the root controller creating the workload. Yes. Like
so then so in that case, how would it work like with a job controller? Like the job controller will just ignore the workload creation if it sees.
Job controller is aware that it's part of the job set, right? Because it has like owner reference. So it sees that, hey, I'm part of the job set. And in that case, I don't need to run the code for creating the workload. And like it's similar for other nested controllers.
Because I'm trying to like understand, because in that case, you kind of like force controllers to embed a template in their struct. Like one particular example, right? Like we build a train job on top of your job set today, and we do have this idea of, runtime and the job. And the runtime is where actually we define, some system parameters, and the train job is actually a reference to the runtime when you want to trigger it. So like I'm trying to understand if the workload owner is not exposing the template of the underlying, building blocks, how would that work? Like in particular, like, for example, like go ahead.
Yeah, let's follow up. Like if you have some example that you don't see, like, or you see problems with that, I will be really happy to see it, because like I'm also, it's not like I'm 100% convinced like it will work in every case. I hope so, but yeah, if you like, let's follow up on this. Like if you can send me like exactly like your API for the
because I think like what you mentioned about the building blocks, right? I think it just gives us more flexibility, right, in a way how those building blocks can be integrated, right, with the true controllers.
That's a trade-off, right? You get something, but you also like something. So yeah, definitely.
I mean, in general, the goal for this doc is not like to propose to like get approval. The goal is to start the discussion. Like, so I think like those are exactly the discussions we want to have. Like,
or we can have the like the general thing that we need to update, or everyone wanted, agreed that we need to update in the workload API, so we can update them. And then if there is something specific for this job set or anything, they should handle it by themselves, right? So, for example, the topology constraint, for example, everyone wanted to be able to update it. Everyone wanted this to be mutable. So this should be in a general, or like a global, or something entry in the upstream, because everyone wanted to update it. But if there is something specific for job set, they can add it to their APIs. I don't know.
Yeah, like again, like we all should be authors here. So like please contribute to this doc, like add comments. I can give you like edit rights. So like but as Wojtek said, it's not like a ask for approval, is actually to start discussion, right? And like to make sure we, and like also to make it clear, two problems are also not covered, like one yet and one like on purpose, because that should be a separate doc. So one is I said about this mutability, but also like the min count, and like we already promised, I believe Keba in your help for job, that we will like propose a solution for like mutating the min count in 137. So I want this to be like a separate doc, because like this problem is already big enough, right? And but the other thing that we should cover here, and there were like questions about this, is because this now only covers the part when we are translating the real controller spec to workload API or workload object, right? But then there is like so this another part for a controller like creating the runtime, the pod groups, right, and managing them. And like I believe we should also have something here, because like it might be like once you know which template is for which pod group, I think translation should be simple, but actually agreeing like who should do what, like let's say whether job sets should be creating pod groups for the jobs or it should be job control responsibility, I think that's still open discussion. So yeah, just wanted to make it clear.
Thank you, Matt. So let's have Kevin question, and then we can move to the next item if it's okay with everyone. Kevin?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I see Roman here. Edwin, are you gonna be able to talk about that?
Yeah, I can talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. All right, perfect. Yeah, I guess I forgot what it was. You guys were talking for a while. I forgot what I was gonna say. I'm actually pretty supportive of this change. My main issue with the workload template, I mean, some of it is speed. Like embedding a workload template in something like the job API does mean like we can't really do that until the workload API is V1. Like we cannot embed a beta or a V1 alpha API until. So I like the idea of encapsulating this in kind of a library. So because I think that this feature it's probably good to start building blocks there. But I mean, that's for in-tree controllers. I think this makes sense. As someone that did look at embedding the workload, it is quite complicated. And so I do like the idea of trying to streamline this as much as possible. And yeah, I guess I was pretty happy so far. Like, I mean, I guess it is a bummer that like we like it would be nice to have like a workload template or a pod group template, because that's kind of effectively what we're trying to do. But I do think like it might be it will make the APIs really quite large for job set or even leader worker set if we have to define those in line. But anyway, that was all I had to say.
So just quickly, I think on this point, did we consider actually embedding the entire workload template to those controllers, but having them sort of admission webhook and validation webhook to simplify creation? Like let's say, like for example, like we don't allow users to set the min count in a workload template in a job set, but job set is admission webhook, right? So defaulter, which basically set this value on behalf of the user.
This is like only part of the problem, right? So you only are validating, but you still expect the user to know what is the valid structure of the workload, right? And like for some more complex workloads, like disaggregated LWS, right, where we might need like tree levels and specific policies. So you actually put this burden of user like researching and knowing what is the exact structure of the workload I should use, right? That's why I personally don't like this idea, but yeah, like.
Mm-hmm. And there is no way to actually leverage, admissions, right, to simplify the creation. Yeah, because like we don't know like in advance, like which part of leader worker set or job set wants to be a part of the pre-fold decode, right?
Yeah, like what is the structure of the workload? Like, what should be structured? Pod group template, pod subgroup template, etc. Right? Like now it's simple. We only have one level, but in the future, you can get quite complex tree expressing like a single workload. And
yeah, makes sense.
Emission, I don't think is going to work for queue. At least like a lot of times to suspend. Usually when workloads are suspended or not, like they do want to mutate some of these scheduling constraints. So I'd actually it probably is not a good idea to go like with putting this all upon creation, because I mean I think we do like Q already has a lot of use cases where they will patch like node selectors and topology is done on a suspended workload effectively, or like a pod. So I think we definitely should probably consider not just admission time. But anyway, I think we can go to the next topic.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to the next topic.
Oh, I wanted to maybe touch on the third one just real quick. Are we, because I guess we have 2 weeks left for the freeze, right? Do we have someone lined up to kind of finish the review? Because it seems like I'm not even sure what to review right now.
Yeah, the create API. I think the PR for adding the V1 Alpha 2 APIs, it's still not merged, and everyone depends on it.
Yes, like we are working on that with Tim. Tim is super busy, unfortunately, but he promised like on Wednesday. Now he's like on like some, I think in another office and like doing something important, which is what Tim usually does at his level. But he promised like on Wednesday that will be on top of his priority list to review all the API changes, both for
Next
like
Wednesday?
this Wednesday. This Wednesday.
Oh, so
Yeah.
we still have 3 days without this PR merged. Okay.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
And like the we can maybe cover more on the, because we are still like doing some progress, right? Like for example, for tasks, we are merging some PRs, reviewing them wherever we can like go without the API. But yeah, overall that's a big problem. And
Okay, that's
Okay.
fine. No, I mean that's good that we have at least some commitment. Yeah, hopefully it goes in smoothly.
yeah, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah. Edwin?
Hey, so Roman and I were discussing about potential use cases for gang scheduling, and one of the big ones was disaggregated serving with multi-node workloads. This basically adds a lot of different layers, or needs a lot of different layers in gang scheduling. So as a basic example, there's decode and prefill servers, but even then, like a prefill server is going to be multi-node itself. So we have leader workers and a prefill server level. Then a serving instance is composed of like decode and prefill. So in order to be able to serve a request end to end, you need both a decode and a prefill replica. So this basically means that when we're scheduling, we always want to have the guarantee of having a prefill server and a decode server at all times, at least one. But they also need to be able to scale independently. Like we don't want like, oh, we're always going to have a 1-to-1 ratio between prefill and decode, because they have different demands, and at points we want to like have more prefill and basically be able to scale independently to also be more efficient when it comes to serving requests. But we need the minimum requirement, having at least one decode and one prefill at all times. If, for example, a replica has to be preempted, we want it to be preempted in a way where the one-to-one mapping still, there's still a prefill and a decode server. And this is on top of all the requirements that we have already for a simple multi-node serving replica. For the leader and the workers, we always want a leader to be scheduled, and the workers, we can have like a little bit more leeway on like how many workers we can have scheduled. And yeah, you basically have like different levels of gang scheduling. And we took a look at the current proposal for the Workload API, and we realized like, hey, there's something missing here where that lets us have the one-to-one guarantee of like decode and prefill servers. Roman and I brainstormed a little bit. We didn't take a look too deeply into it, and especially since we don't have the context of how hard this would actually be to implement. But an idea we came up with was having a second layer between adding like another level between like pod subgroup and the pod set gang. But in discussion, we also realized that was Matt and other people proposed like, oh, maybe we can add like a new policy at the pod subgroup level where we can have like a minimum set of gangs per pod subgroup. This is still like open to discussion. It's just a use case that we noticed that wasn't being currently addressed, and we just wanted to start the discussion related to it and just see what work needs to be done and if it's even possible to address it. So
Okay. Yeah, I read the proposal, and first of all, I have one question. I didn't get the pod unit. I know that you need two different gangs, and then you need to like group them together, like have the minimum for each one of these gang, min count for each one of these gangs to be together as well as a gang. So you would have something like 3 gangs, right? Is that right? So
yeah,
what is the pod unit? Because I didn't get it.
the goal is just to be able to guarantee that there's gonna be at least a prefill server and a decode server at all times.
Mhm.
We don't if we put them together in a gang currently, you can have like they can scale up and they're going to be still part of the same gang. So one of them, if a decode server falls, then the whole gang needs to be preempted.
Okay.
We don't want that. We don't
Yeah.
care if like one of the replicas falls, but what we do care is at least having a decode and a prefill at all times.
Okay.
So like, if you try to model that with just pod group and pod subgroup, like you notice you actually miss one level, because whatever you do, you want to be able to satisfy all the three requirements that prefill and decode are like gang, leader plus worker. You need at least one of those two, right? At least one leader, or in more general case, at least n prefills and at least m decodes. And you want to be able to scale them independently, right? So yeah. So we want.
Yeah, for the current workload we have right now, you can create a bot group for the prefill, another bot group for the decode, but you don't have any way to have again.
Exactly. But then you miss a policy that spans those two, saying at least one this pod group and at least one this, right? That exactly. That's why you need like another.
Yeah, I had a proposal. If you recall this, I think Wojtek, you commented on that. It was to have like have something like scheduling affinity. Like it's like, hey, this depends on that. So inside every bot group, you can have like scheduling affinity or dependency, something like that, whatever the name. Or I think in that case, in Matt's case, you called it policy. So, for example, this like this pod group will not be able to get scheduled until the like the first and second pod groups already got the men count, reached the men count, something like that.
So basically,
yeah,
that's the approach that Grove uses, right? They have this like cost scheduling policy.
Really? Okay. Yeah,
yes.
This actually, like in my old proposal, I had this in a very deep detail, which is basically scheduling affinity. It's like, hey, this is my rules for each pod group to like to get it scheduled. So let's if we can discuss this again if this possible. I think Wojtek was opposing it because he says we tried this like in the past, and like all the multi dependencies might get very complicated. But to be honest, I feel like this is I don't know how to compare this with all these multi layers that we are getting right now, because it's getting really complicated.
Just to make it clear, like we can also solve that without introducing like cost scheduling policy, whatever you call it, and without introducing this pod unit, right? If you take a look at the comments, we are like with Wojtek proposing like a new policy that at the pod group level that actually can also solve that.
Yeah.
And overall, like those are two solutions to the same problem, and in a way they both can work, right? You can either express like this cost scheduling as a dependence between like two arbitrary nodes in this graph, right? Or you can say it's always a tree and you have like different policy and different level, right? And you can always exactly we are just going with different approach here in our current design, right? So we propose a tree. Like personally, I like tree better, right? Because overall trees are easier to analyze than like random graph, where you can actually create dependency on different levels, etc. And it's also easier, I think, for scheduler to implement that. Maybe also like for users it's easier because there's like less ways to express something. But yeah, like if you take a look at the comments, we are proposing a way to solve that with this tree structure. Wojtek?
Well, I think like I wanted to mention to follow up on like what Heba mentioned, like why I was opposing, because effectively like this introducing this like dependencies on each other, it's kind of like introducing another layer anyway. So like it's not visibly different approach. You are just saying that we will introduce some way of expressing dependencies on higher. We are just saying like instead of doing that higher, we will do that like on lower, but like conceptually they are like
it's different representation. It's different representation for the same thing. I agree with that. Yeah. Okay. My thing is people already get used to affinity, like pod affinity and node affinity. So if you introduce a scheduling affinity, they will, like it's like, yeah, okay, we get it. We get the concept. instead of just spending time understanding the, like the hierarchy we are introducing here. But again, I agree with you, Wojtek, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same
But
thing.
we don't like pod affinity.
Yeah.
We don't like it, yeah?
No.
It's like
That's why
we've
those
seen so many
groups solve some of those problems.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
like it might be even like thought as like a disadvantage that because like people are doing so strange things with like pod affinity and anti-affinity that like
Okay.
we rather don't want to them to like come up with like similar ideas here. So and
Okay.
anyway, yeah.
Kevin?
Maybe I'll be honest, I have a hard time following a lot of the conversation around this. There's no like I don't even know what API people are using for disaggregated serving. I think I saw some comments in there, but I worry that without like a backing CRD or a controller, there's not much. Like I don't think the experience of this is going to be great. So I've been trying to push some of the LMD folks on my end to like, because I had some use cases where, I was thinking for queue and serving, like preemption might be useful, but then some people are saying, there needs to be some kind of desired ratio of pre-fill to decode workers for preemption actually to work. And I have no idea how you would ever orchestrate that with whatever we are doing right now. So I'm just hoping that like that is, I think, a major outcome we probably do need. I don't know if it's Grove or a K6 API, but I feel like there's a gap here that has to be addressed.
Yeah, from
Yeah,
our
I
side,
don't-
we're also, sorry.
I just wanted to say that like I had exactly the same comment somewhere, like either in this doc
Yeah.
or in some other doc. So like yes, I fully agree with you like that.
Yeah,
Really.
so Grove can handle it as of right now. It's they have the right abstractions to deploy disaggregated-serving workloads, and on the leader worker side, we're also pushing LMD. We've had discussions with some people in the LMD community about adding like a layer above leader worker set, like a control above leader worker set that basically functions the way leader worker set works now, where you basically have like a controller that creates two leader worker sets objects, one as a prefill and one as a decode, and orchestrates it at that level. So it is in the plans, still kind of early stages. We're waiting on the LMD community. We need to push harder. But yeah, that's our end goal as well, to at some point have a controller that can orchestrate secondary serving workloads. But for now, we're just, since that's still early stages, we want to kind of pave the road of this is our requirements. We need this to be ready, so that way once we have the controller available, we can easily integrate and speed up the timelines.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that we have Antoni today on the call. I think his first time. I asked him to work on that. So translating the requirements from this doc into the design of the evolution of Workload API, right? So what exactly we need to add, like the pod subgroup, and also some new policy, right? So basically making sure we have these requirements somewhere on the roadmap and we know how to translate that to what we need to change on the Workload API to support that. And Antoni also will be working to help with the in the same manner with the job set integration, right? I also see, I think, Anu on the call and Kevin, so he will be reaching out to you probably to also figure out what are the requirements, what exactly we need on the Workload API side to make integrations with job set possible, which also very likely is pod subgroup, but maybe also something else. Yeah, Antoni, do you want to say hello or?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Antoni, and I'll probably reach out to you folks later in the second half of this week after I get a bit more acknowledged with the current state of affairs.
Welcome, Anthony. Okay. And we are going to have a discussion on this doc or in another doc for this specific thing.
I don't know. We can treat these as requirements, right? And then we can either extend that to also cover the like solution and the needed changes on the API side, Workload API side, or we can create another one. I don't know. Like that's up to you.
Just wanted to know what is the, like what is the space that we can share the discussion and the ideas. Okay, perfect.
So I guess like once Anthony will have something, he will definitely share on Slack or somewhere, right? And then we can all comment and take a look. Like in the end, we will need cap, right? Because that's where all this goes. Like for the changes in, I think like 137 in the Workload API, right? What we need. So
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sorry for that. What is the pod unit by the end of it? Because I didn't get it yet.
It's another level, just another level. So you can express like this, yeah.
Yeah, it's nothing concrete. It was a name that I asked Gemini to come up with because I just needed like an extra layer.
But we would rather want to be going with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, an extra layer. Yeah, it sounds complex, but we preferred it over the other option, at least for the proposal, because we didn't know how hard it would be to add a different scheduling policy at the schedule level.
Okay. Yeah. So overall, like my philosophy is like, I think also like Wojtek's, right? Like we believe in like adding more policies over like extending this hierarchy, because extending hierarchy is like expensive, right? In general.
I agree.
Another resource, like, and also like we need to have a really concrete set of use case, not the one use case, but many use cases, right? To consider like adding another level. So yeah, that's why we actually believe like if we can solve that with policy, then we should go with policy.
Yeah, I believe it would be nice if we can have like a brainstorming session just to go for virtual levels, virtual hierarchy, like 4 or maybe more, and see if this new policy that we are trying to get will, will solve the problem until at least, like the 4th level or not. Just, like to see, like trying to see if this will work in the future. Okay. Any other question for the disaggregated proposal? Okay, thank you. Okay, going back to the agenda, we don't have anything else. Any question? Anything else that we need to discuss? Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. See you next week. Okay.